Hello everyone, and welcome back to the garage with Bonesaw. Today we'll be taking a look at the French Tier 6 light tank, the AMX 12T. Now, the AMX 12T first appeared as a design in 1946, right after the war had ended. And this was a time when the French were really starting to restart their vehicle and weapons industry. And this was mainly because of the fact that during the war, after France had been occupied, Germany had not necessarily dismantled, but redistributed a lot of the French industry for their own uses, and also a lot of French engineers had left their jobs, deciding not to aid the Germans or fled abroad. And so the French decided that they really needed to rebuild their military production capacity as quickly as possible, otherwise they were going to lose a lot of that talent pool to overseas. It's the same reason why the ARL-44 was designed right at the ending years of the war. Even though it wasn't a particularly good tank overall, it had some innovative design features which the French were really keen to kind of put into the design in order to preserve the production capacity that their nation had. Now, in regards to the AMX 12T, it never actually went into production. Instead, the design was kind of further modified and eventually evolved into the AMX 13, which was introduced into the 1950s and was exported successfully to a number of countries. And it's a really good indication of the French way of thinking in regards to armor after the first years after the Second World War. Now, one of the big factors that influenced the French armored doctrine was the idea that armor was now irrelevant, with a lot of the late war developments, things like heat rounds and the armor-piercing fin-stabilized self-discarding saber rounds that the British had invented. Armor on tanks was really becoming a much more of a cost rather than a benefit, especially if your average soldier can carry a bazooka or one of the early RPGs, which can very easily take out a tank with just one soldier. So the French decided that armor was no longer a priority on their vehicles. Instead, speed and firepower were going to be their modus operandi for engaging into combat. Hence, a lot of their post-war designs feature this. This is an oscillating turret. Now, an oscillating turret differs from a standard turret in that if we have a look at, say, the Tetrarch, as you can see with the Tetrarch, you have the turret, which is a fixed point on a rotating bearing, your turret ring, and then you have your gun, which is mounted on like a crossbar, essentially a pair of trunnions, which allow it to move up and down, and it has a mantlet on the front to stop any shots entering the turret. But essentially, it means you have 3 points of movement. That is the movement of the turret, and the movement of the gun up and down, and the movement of the mantlet. And these are separate parts. And you have some issues there with gun stabilization when it's on the move, things like that, and also the movement of the gun breech within the tank. With an oscillating turret, instead of having the gun mounted on trunnions, the gun is mounted directly into the upper half of the turret. The turret is now separated into two halves instead of one. It has the lower half, which is on the rotational bearing, the turret ring, and the upper half is then mounted on trunnions on the lower half. So the whole upper half of the turret moves when you move the gun up and down. This has a couple of advantages. One, you can have a shorter turret. You don't need to have as much room to move the gun up and down because the gun breech moves with the roof of the turret as well, which means you don't need to have a high turret roof to point your gun down. You don't need to have a deep turret ring in order to swing your gun up. The other advantage of a oscillating turret is the fact that you can easily mount an auto-loading system in the tank. Most auto-loading systems encounter a problem when it comes to the actual loading cycle, and that is the fact that the gun breech generally needs to return to a fixed point in order for the shell to be extracted and a new one to be loaded into the gun. And that means your gun essentially has to be re-aimed every time you fire the gun and the shell extraction process occurs. In an oscillating turret, you don't have this problem. Because the gun itself doesn't actually move relative to the turret, the gun can be fixed here, the breech will remain stationary, and means you can have this autoloader bustle right behind it, which can easily reload the gun without having to account for the moving of the breech. Overall, oscillating turrets they were all the rage in about the 50s. The Americans tried building them as well. That's why we have an American tank line in World of Tanks which features oscillating turrets, but they kind of died out after that, and there was a couple of reasons for that. One of them was armor envelope. With these two moving parts, it's really hard to make an effective armor facing to deflect shot, which for the French wasn't a problem because they didn't really care about armor. They felt it was now an irrelevance in combat. The other problem also is that there are a lot of wear and tear on the bearings in the turret, and there's also an issue with sealing them against chemical weapons and nuclear fallout, things like that. Water also can get in through the turret bearing. That's why if you see a lot of real life examples of the AMX 13, they actually have a rubber in canvas seal around the oscillating turret join. But overall, the main focus really was the autoloader. Now, autoloaders don't actually exist for the reason people think they exist. A lot of people assume the point of an autoloader is to increase the rate of fire of a tank, to essentially turn the cannon into a machine gun. And that's not entirely true. Increasing the rate of fire can happen, but that's not the real purpose of an autoloader. The purpose of an autoloader is actually to remove a member of the crew. It means you don't have a loader in the tank anymore. The machine does the job for you. The idea of that, it means you can have a smaller turret and use space more efficiently. And that's one of the reasons why the French were really going for this. The French were really trying to push down the size of their tanks. It's the same with a lot of their other vehicles like the AMX 40, AMX 50B and such, which we see in the game, their heavy tank line. They were really trying to make the vehicles smaller, lighter, and faster, because the idea is that they would be a very hard target. You would ambush your opponent, you'd kind of pop up over a ridge, empty your drum loader magazine, and then move away before your opponent could re-engage you, because you'd just be too fast for them to bring their guns to bear. You'd either have destroyed them, or you'd be away and out of sight. And so the autoloader really caught on in France with the oscillating turret. Unfortunately, on some of the larger designs, it didn't really work. And this is due to the fact that as they mounted larger guns, the turrets had to be larger and taller, and this eventually offset the benefits of the oscillating turret design. And so it only really was successful on the AMX 13. So let's have a look at the AMX 12T in World of Tanks. What are the benefits of this tank? It is obviously a light tank at tier 6. So, in the French tradition, it has actually a surprising amount of firepower. As carrying on from the ELC AMX, you have a choice of two guns. The first one is the SA-49. You know it from the ELC AMX. It's one of the not the first 75mm gun you get, but the second one on the ELC AMX. And as far as 75mm guns go, it's entirely adequate. It has 108mm of penetration with standard armor-piercing rounds with 110 damage per shot. Now, at tier 6 that's not amazing, but for a light tank it'll get you by. Fighting against artillery and other light tanks it'll do. If you encounter something bigger like a medium tank or a heavy tank, you might struggle a little bit, but if you play the AMX 12T to its strengths, it shouldn't really matter. The next gun you get is the 75mm SA-50. Now this gun is a vast improvement. It increases the average damage to 135 per shot, and your average penetration goes up to 144 with standard armor-piercing rounds. That's roughly equal to the gun that's mounted on the Panther, the stock Panther gun, the German L70. And if we have a look at it in stats, it's pretty much comparable as well. It has .36 accuracy, and roughly the same penetration, with 202mm of penetration with premium rounds should you need it. It also bears mentioning that both of these guns are 6-shot autoloaders, with a roughly 2.2 second reload time per shell. The downside of that is it will require about 20 seconds to reload the whole magazine once you've fired 6 shots. The other downside comes with a 2.5 second aiming time. It is somewhat lengthy, and that can really cause you problems if you focus too much on trying to use this thing as a gun tank. Now, that gun is great. It's really, really useful for taking out your opponents, and it is arguably one of the best guns on a tier 6 light tank. The downside of it is that the firepower sometimes tricks people. The AMX 12T is a light tank. You're not a gun tank. You don't want to sit there duking it out with your opponents. And this is for two reasons. One, you don't have much armor. Only 50mm at the front, and granted it is a very good slope on that 50mm. You can bounce rounds if you're lucky, but it's not the norm. It won't happen frequently. Only 40mm on the turret, 20mm side on both the turret and the hull, 15 rear hull armor, 20 rear hull armor. You will get wrecked by high explosive. You will get wrecked by most anti-tank guns, things like the IS's DT-25, big guns that you'll start seeing now will really do a number on you. Secondly, your engine is frontally mounted. That means if you take a hit in the front, chances are you will lose your engine. That's a danger for a light tank. The next problem is the fact that this tank doesn't move very quickly for a light tank. The top speed is listed as 60 kilometers an hour. Generally, you'll average out at about 45. And you actually have a good power to weight ratio. It only has a power to weight ratio of about 20, which is pretty good for a light tank, 20 horsepower per ton. But it's just the fact that it has very poor soft stats. Its traction's pretty bad, because if you look at those tracks, very narrow tracks, not good ground pressure, it gets bogged down pretty quick, and that means you really need to keep your speed up and keep moving. The other problem with that, though, is people try to play it like, say, the 5916 or the MT25 and fire on the move. With that 6-shot autoloader, you really can't afford to waste the shots. You can't just blaze out of nowhere, empty the drum, and then blaze off, because often you won't have the speed to make the getaway. The way to attack in this tank is you need to find an opponent who you know you can kill with your drum, your 6-shot drum, even if you miss 1 or 2 shots. So, let's do some math. It does 135 damage per shot. Let's call that 140. 140 times 6 works out as roughly about 810 damage in your full magazine, accounting for also variations in average damage. If you subtract 2 shots from that, assuming you miss or bounce, that leaves you with about 540 damage. That's generally the ideal bracket you want to find enemies on. So if you find a damaged enemy, you ambush them out of nowhere, empty your drum, they should be dead, no chance of retaliation, then you run away. Reload the drum, rinse and repeat. And this makes you a very potent threat on the battlefield, because your gun does have good penetration and good damage. You just have to make sure that you will get out. You either have to be able to outrun your opponent, which in this tank isn't particularly likely, or you have to make sure that they die before you do. And it does take a lot of opportunism, and you need to be very, very stealthy in this tank. It's very much an opportunistic assassin of a tank. It has a lot of firepower for a light tank, but not much survivability in terms of speed. Another problem with the tank is also that its gun depression and gun elevation isn't very good, which means that unlike, say, the Type 64, you can't really kind of hug the ridges and things like that, pop up, take some shots, and then disappear. You really have to make sure that your opponents either don't know where you are or will be dead pretty soon after they've found out where you are. Overall, I do like to run this as a scout tank. It is much better as a scout than the ELC AMX is, because even though it's slower, it has a longer view range and a better signal range, which means you just throw on some binoculars, camo net, passive scout up first half of the game, take some opportunistic shots at enemies who aren't paying attention, and then go active, look for enemies, help your teams get those flank shots in. This thing can do some amazing damage if you attack enemies who aren't paying attention. If they're focusing more heavily on things that are in front of them, you can do some real good damage to opponents from the side, especially with the very reliable penetration on this gun. Think heavy tanks, things like ISs, Tigers, especially things like the slow tanks like the KV-3, you can really do an extreme amount of damage if you get on their flanks and their rear. And if you make sure that they're not paying attention to you. So overall, the biggest weakness of this tank, however, is its matchmaking. Now, I know previously I've kind of been making this thing sound very weak in terms of how well it plays at its own tier 6, tier 7. And I apologize if I've kind of given that impression, but realistically, it's a tank that has a very niche role and a very niche playstyle, and I'm just trying to forewarn you of that. It's in fact a very powerful tank at its own tier. When it starts to struggle a bit is when it starts getting to tier 9 and 10 battles, and this will happen because you do have scout matchmaking, you have +4 tiers. And the problem there is the fact that the tank is quite slow, and that generally speaking, the medium tanks you'll be facing, things like the E50, E50M, the Pattons, the T57 Heavy, things like that. You'll be seeing a lot of things like that that are very, very fast. They have better view range than you, better guns, better armor, and they will essentially outclass you. The mediums on your team and on the opponent's team will do a better job of the job you're supposed to do. And that's where you really need to struggle, and you really, really need to play as carefully as possible to maximize the benefits of your tank. and you will struggle a little bit. However, even then you can still do some good damage. The penetration of your gun, whilst comparatively weak, is still adequate. If you get around behind things, if you do what you're supposed to do as a light tank, stay hidden, spot the enemy, get on the flanks, you can do a capable amount of damage, and you can even take out some of those higher tier medium tanks if you get the right opportunity. But you know, it's a light tank. You shouldn't expect to be carrying games in a light tank. From tier 5 onwards, light tank's job is recon. It's not dealing damage. Tier 1 to 3, yeah, you're a line tank, you can do whatever. Tier 5 onwards, it's recon, spotting, and getting those opportunistic kills in if you need to. Just always make sure that you have an adequate amount of rounds in your magazine, and that you have an escape route. Use a lot of the terrain as much as possible in order to kind of keep the speed up, keep your energy going, and keep mobile when you need to be. And this tank will prove to be an incredibly effective light tank on the battlefield. Very good tool in the right hands, and it's a lot of fun, provided that you can adapt to that niche playstyle. So here we are on Prokhorovka in the French tier 6 light tank, the AMX 12T. As you can see, my magazine is just loading up, all 6 shots of 75mm, and I'm just heading straight for the center ridge, where most light tanks go for their scouting runs. So generally speaking, I'm just going to open up with the standard scouting technique on this map, just do some runs along the ridge to spot any enemy tanks that might be in the open field along here, and possibly encounter any enemy light tanks. As you can see, I've already spotted a medium tank and the enemy scout, the MT-25. As you can see, my gun depression on this tank is hindering my engagement. I can't really engage the MT-25 on this slope. In some of my other light tanks, I might be able to engage him, but in the 12T I just don't have the gun depression to engage on this slope, and I really don't want to expose myself to any enemy fire. It is a tier 7 game, so there are some quite potent guns out there. A lot of Russian 122mm guns, and a Su-152 with the very powerful 152mm howitzer, more than capable of killing me in a single shot with my comparatively thin armor. So once again, I'm just going to do my scouting runs, try and keep the enemy lit up so our allies can keep shooting them. Unfortunately, we don't have any artillery in this game though, so realistically I can't really provide indirect fire support in that way. So I'm just moving up here, trying to get some spots on these heavy tanks, but I really don't want to get seen. I do run octane fuel on this tank to give it that little bit of extra pep when it's moving. However, this tank does not accelerate particularly fast, and it doesn't hold speed very well. Its top speed generally averages out at about 40 kilometers an hour with maneuvering. On the straight it can get up to about 60, but generally speaking you will be maneuvering and you will be trying to avoid incoming enemy fire, and that will drag down your speed. So as you can see, just playing it by ear here, trying to keep low, keep out of sight while still getting some opportunistic spots on the enemy. Alright, going to come up here, aim my gun in. I'm pretty sure I'm clear. Put some shots into this IS. Unfortunately I missed that second shot, so I'm going to back off now, because I don't want any of those mediums taking shots at me. I'm pretty sure I've been spotted as well. Alright, I have 4 shots left in the magazine, no need to reload at the moment. Plenty of wounded enemies that I could potentially go after. However, I don't want to crest that ridge because there are still plenty of enemies on a decent amount of health, and so I decided to reload the magazine and instead do a counter push on this medium tank that's coming over here. He's an M7, so I can very easily kill him if I have a full magazine. As you can see, the magazine load on this tank isn't too unbearable. It's about 20 seconds, which is the same as some artillery pieces. So if you're an artillery player like me, you can get used to the reload, and you just need to time it correctly. Generally speaking, you want to be as far out of combat as possible when you're reloading. Unfortunately, missed my first shot. Going to pull back, don't want to give my position away. An M7 can penetrate me. Once again, trying not to take as much damage as possible. Generally speaking, the best way to play this tank is to be very opportunistic like this. Wait for enemies to kind of give you their sides, and then you can unload a drum into them. So that's a good hit on that KV-3 up there. Just going to move myself behind this rock to make sure that the enemy don't really get any flank shots into me while I'm pushing up and trying to get some spots on targets. Oh, there's a KV-2 there. Put some effective fire into his very large turret. As you can see, there's some good penetration on this top auto-loading gun. It's roughly the same as a German L70 75mm, so roughly 150mm of penetration and 150 damage per shot. As you can see, very easily taking out this M6. One of the advantages of the autoloader system, despite the long reload in between magazines, when you are engaged with a target in close quarters, especially something like an M7 or anything else that has enough health that you can kill in a single magazine, you really can bully tanks in close succession fights. You can also, with the accuracy on this gun, provide some good long-range fire support when you're not providing a role as an active or passive scout, which means that unlike some light tanks where you often feel like you're very much not useful in the engagement, you can really put some good damage out on the enemy. So avoiding that KV2 is looking my way, and I really didn't want him to get any good shots on me, so I'll take him down to low health and let the AMX M4 have him. I'm going to move up here and wait for my gun to reload, hopefully getting the outflank on some of these heavy tanks down here, and avoiding any potential derps from that ISU. He's either in the forest or he's on the island. My money is on the island at the moment, but I can always be wrong. I've been wrong before. And spotted a medium tank. I'm going to try and get as low as possible, get out of his gun range, and let the allies finish him off. That's generally one of the things you've really got to learn to do in this tank, because it does have some effective firepower, is when to stay and fight, when to just spot people for the allies. And generally speaking, you can also be quite sneaky and ninja some kills like this. As you can see, I'll just wait for my gun to aim in. That Su-152 doesn't appear to be going anywhere, and I'll pick up a quick kill there. Generally speaking, the accuracy on this gun is great so long as you let it aim. When you're on the move, its accuracy is somewhat compromised, and that's the last enemy dead, so I can't quite ninja that IS, and generally speaking, a pretty good game. So here we are again in the AMX 12T, and this time around we're on Sand River, and if you're looking carefully, yeah, that's right, we're in a tier 10 game. This is one of the things that can happen with the AMX 12T, because it is a tier 6 scout. It can and will get into tier 10 battles on a semi-regular basis. I have been in worse battle matches than this, with like pretty much full tier 10s and then me at the bottom as a lone little tier 6. And ultimately you will struggle a little bit in games like this, because the AMX 12T doesn't have a colossal amount of view range. It has a decent amount, but generally speaking, most of the tier 10s will outmatch you in terms of view range. So you really need to make the best of what you can as an active scout and try and do what you can. Passive scouting doesn't work quite as well unless you are in a very favourable position. So I'm just going to do some quick active scouts along this ridge line, try and stick to the ridge, stay in cover. Whoops, spot an AMX 1390. I don't want to get engaged with him. His 90mm gun punches a lot harder than mine does. He has more health than I do, so realistically not getting involved in that. However, I will let our mediums take him down gladly and just keep cruising the ridge, try and get some active spots for our allies as they advance. And that way they'll know what the disposition of enemy forces on this flank are, and we can pick up some good spotting XP. So our E50's taken down their 1390, which is helpful. It means the enemy have less scouts than we do. We now have a scouting advantage with 2 tier 6 lights. And still just popping my turret over the ridge to get some spots. But most of our allies have moved up now, and my role here is kind of redundant. I'm noticing the other flanks somewhat vulnerable, so I'm going to move around and try and get some spots over there for our allies who are back in base defending. Now, at the moment I'm a little bit concerned because we have a good deal of allies concentrated in the base, and generally speaking I'm of the opinion that camping the spawn is possibly the worst defensive position you can take in World of Tanks. While it might seem good, like there's a lot of cover, generally speaking that cover is very restrictive. You're giving the enemy a lot of map access, and in my opinion it's actually one of the worst positions you can take up in terms of a defense. Thankfully, however, we do have one heavy tank who's kind of moving out, and so hopefully he can blunt the enemy advance. As you can see, this is my standard scouting run along Sand River. Normally I start in the south and then kind of head north. Thankfully I've been spotted. Thankfully that shot missed. Trying to get to the cover of the dunes there. That's one of the good advantages of the route I take, is you use the jutons to the max to conceal yourself from the enemy, give yourself as much cover whilst trying to spot. And as you can see here, the weakness of my view range, picking up a bit of speed on the dune to try and get my escape in, but I didn't really spot anything up on that ridge line. And we know that there was probably a good number of tier 8 tank destroyers up there, possibly even some of the Jagdpanzer E100s. So instead I'm going to pop in behind these mediums, try and get some spots up. Thankfully my tracks saved me there. And bouncing some shots from a tier 9, which is always good to see. Unfortunately bouncing off the back of his turret. I was hoping to try and hit him in the ammo rack, but realistically here I'm just being a nuisance. It's all about distracting their attention and hopefully getting a little bit of damage. Somehow I miraculously managed to survive an auto-loaded dump from a tier 7. And as you can see, I'm in a good position here to just keep spotting them, keep the spot damage up, and generally just divide their attention. I am the only light tank left on our team, which is a little bit of a concern. And oh dear, the M48's up on my flank. I really don't want to be engaging him across this berm, because his gun depression exceeds mine by a tremendous amount. I've only got 2 shots left in the magazine, so I'm not sure if I should go for a reload yet. There are enemies in the immediate vicinity, so if I do go for a reload I will be extremely vulnerable. However, we do have a T62, I believe, who's on 2%, so I'm going to try and sneak around and see if I can get some damage on him. Alright, snuck past the M48. Unfortunately that one bounces. Finish up the T62A, that's a tier 10 kill for a tier 6, I think that's pretty good. Alright, now I've got to wait for the magazine reload, so I'm going to try and back down, avoid that GW Tiger if I can, and try and get the reload in. Alright, I've got my mag up, 6 shots, and an M48 who's very alone, and with a, I do believe a T110 E5 facing down him, so I'm going to try and get behind him, and that way we can kind of double team this guy, distract him, and just take him to pieces. So I've got my first shot into him, T110 puts another shot into him, and he's got his rear to me. 2 more shots. Picking myself a tier 9 kill, so that's pretty good so far. 2 kills for a tier 6, both of them at least 3 tiers higher. I'm going to move up to this ridgeline now and hopefully get some speed down the slope on the other side. Alright, we've got some spots on a Jagdpanzer E100. See, as you can see, the view range on the AMX 12T isn't great. That tank destroyer easily spotted that Jagdpanzer E100 from a position where I was earlier, and I couldn't spot him at all. And the Jagdpanzer E100 doesn't have a abundance of camouflage, so as you can see, tier 10 games you will struggle a bit in terms of scouting, simply because the higher tier vehicles just do it so much better. However, as you can see, you can still contribute. Just because you're a lower tier vehicle doesn't mean that you aren't capable of participating in the battle. Alright, so I'm going to move down a little bit, try and get as close as I can. And at the moment the plan is just to do a bum run, just head straight for the enemy, get as much vision as I can, just disrupt their firing positions. Hopefully I can get some flanks on the GW Tiger P. Alright. It's able to dodge a shot there from the Waffenträger. Alright, I've got the Jagdpanzer E100 distracted. I put some damage on the GW Tiger. Alright. Take a hit from the T-34, lose my track, and I'm taken out by the T-30. But, you know, all is not lost. I've pretty much distracted most of the enemies so they can move up. Their artillery is now dealt with, and we know where they are. So ultimately that will result in a victory for us, with our T-95 claiming a Top Gun, and ultimately a pretty good showing for a Tier 6 light tank in a Tier 10 match.